Welcome to With All Due Respect. This is a podcast for women over 40 who are looking for sane, frank advice about their health and wellness, especially through and after menopause. I'm Amanda Thebe, a personal trainer and nutrition coach, and the author of the best-selling book, Menopocalypse: How I Learned to Thrive During Menopause and How You Can Too. I'd love you to join me every week as I chew the fat with some fab guests on hot topics that directly impact you. I also know the power of conversation is lost, and there's nothing better than sitting down for a natter with your mate and putting the world to rights. And that's exactly what I'll be doing with this podcast. We'll really get to know my guests, warts and all. I've made it my mission to help you by exploding a few myths and presenting you with plain, simple facts. These inspiring conversations will hopefully empower you to be a healthy, strong, resilient bitch, just like me. Before we get started, don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review, and then visit me at amandathebe.com. And now let's get started on today's show. And before we start, it's Chana. I call you Chana.
My tip is Chana masala. Do you eat Indian food?
I love saying one of my favorite dishes.
Mm-hmm. So. There you go.
All right. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to With All Due Respect. I'm Amanda Thebe, and I am joined today by scientist Chana Davis. Chana is a mother of three who lives in Vancouver, Canada. Go Canada. She completed her PhD in genetics at Stanford University with Dr. Pat Brown, who is a biochemist turned founder of Impossible Foods. And we're going to come back to that later. So it's a point worth talking about. Her thesis, though, was on human microbiome and was known as the Baby Poop Project. So I think we'll ask about that too. Chana spent a decade working in biomedical research with a focus on cancer and molecular diagnostics, but in 2017 changed gears and started focusing on science communication. And she founded Fueled by Science. We connected over social media. I say that all the time because it's always how I connect with everybody. But you actually reached out to me, and I can help you because I had a study, and I often just go to the conclusions when I read studies because I don't have a science background. And Chana kindly offered to disseminate this study for me. And I was like, oh my God, she's a keeper. And it's really great to have that type of person out there, like bridging the gap between the scientific world and the general population, because we'll sometimes just see headlines as a general population and run with them. And you're saying, no, let's just dig deeper and actually tell you what the research says, like warts and all, essentially. So anyway, Chana, I'm very excited to have you here. We have lots to talk about, and you're going to try and hopefully change a few people's minds and blow a few myths as well while you're here, right?
Absolutely.
By the way, in Instagram the other day, somebody said to me on voice via text, I love that you're a myth buster, but it actually paused her words and it said that you're a Smiths buster. And like the band, and I'm like, yeah, because panic didn't actually happen on the streets of London. But you're actually going to talk about scientific myths that are literally sort of like in our faces as a general population, and you're going to help us get through those. So let's just do a little bit of an introduction to you. Right. I'd like to know about the philosophy of plant-based eating and how you integrate that into your message and why you think that's important for us to hear.
Yeah. Well, I've been predominantly plant-based, kind of back and forth somewhere between 70 and 99% for the last couple of decades. And I believe that, we don't need to think about eating more plants in absolute terms. As I see it, it's kind of a win-win-win. So eating more plants is, number one, better for animals, number two, better for the planet, and number three, depending on how you do it, it can be better for your health, at least neutral for your health. So the way I look at it, as long as you have some other benefits, as long as you have those other two benefits there, you can do it in a way that's good or even possibly better for your health. And I think...
And you're going to touch on that actually later, aren't you? How when it's sort of like people get pulled in the wrong direction with regard to their health. But I love those three wins. actually a really great way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And, I've looked a lot at, environmental impact, for example, and you can kind of do the math on if I substitute A for B, how much less water and how much less greenhouse gas am I saving? So I think every substitution makes a difference. And that's how I think about it. But for me, I came to it from more just, and I guess an ethical perspective that I just never felt comfortable eating animals. It just never appealed to me. But I'm not someone who's, gets worked up too much about what those are doing around me. So I just kind of do my own thing and show people that it's actually easier than you think it is. And it can be delicious as well.
And, it's really funny because when I think about plant-based eating, I was a vegetarian when I was 18. I think every teenage girl goes through a vegetarian phase. It's plant-based eating now.
Yeah.
But I think that I love the fact that you hit on those 3 points. And one of the reasons I like that is because I think that covers all generations. And this is what I mean by that. So from a health perspective, that's where I'm drawn to eating more plants. My son personally loves following people like Bill Gates and Mark Roper, the NASA scientist that's got a massive YouTube channel. And he's really concerned about climate change.
Yeah.
And he wants to make impacts into his sort of everyday things that promote respect to climate change. I'm losing my words a bit there. And what he did there is he said, I eat lots of vegetables, but I need to eat less meat. And so we've started incorporating the Beyond Meat and Impossible meats into our, I actually don't eat them, but they do. But what's interesting for me is the different reasons that people are drawn towards it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I went to a conference with plant-based protein manufacturers a couple of years ago, and they were presenting market research and echoed exactly what you said, that the motivations for buying those products depended on age group. And it was more of a health thing for older, maybe over 40. And then it was more environmental based under that.
Basically, you've just said you could have saved a ton of money and just come and asked me and I would have told you. So I actually brought you on here today because we've actually got a fairly loose script, but there's some key points that we want to touch on. One of the first things is, as plant-based eaters, a lot of women worry about not getting enough protein and not getting enough complete proteins in their diet. As someone for myself who is a strength coach, and understanding the physiological changes through perimenopause and menopause and its impact on muscle protein synthesis, our ability to, build and maintain muscle. That's something that I talk about a lot. And so you come at this from a little bit of a different angle, and I'm really excited to hear what you've got to say about this. So let's start there. Animal versus plant proteins and what that looks like.
Okay. Let me first say that it drives me nuts when people paint all vegetarian or vegan diets with the same brush, because just like eating it as an omnivorous diet can take many different forms and many different degrees of healthiness and many different compositions, so too can a plant-based diet. So someone who's vegetarian and chooses to eat only fruit, they're in big trouble, right? They're definitely not going to meet their protein needs. But someone who eats is more of the legumes and whole grains and, minimal amounts of super, starch heavy foods, that person is not going to have a problem eating protein. They're not going to have to necessarily sit and count grams at every meal. So both omnivorous and vegetarian or vegan diets can be incredibly diverse. And it's up to you how you kind of build your plate within the umbrella that you're kind of drawing from.
Yeah, extremes never work for anyone, for sure. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and the all fruit one is probably the biggest red flag within the vegetarian and vegan community. That one is a huge problem for many reasons, but protein is definitely one of them. And the other problem is just sort of the junk food vegan, right? There are plenty of, not a huge proportion, but there's a proportion of people who say, well, as long as it's not an animal product, I'll eat it. And therefore it's healthier, or maybe health is not even part of the equation. But
I know when I was 18, being a vegetarian, it was very hard to get healthy vegetarian options. It was a cheese and onion pasty down at the bakery,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. There's also the all pasta vegetarian, right? Which is problematic.
So it's the diversity that matters.
Yes. And so what is the difference between plant and animal proteins? And the honest answer is they're not as different as you think. So a protein, I like to describe it, the analogy I like is a bead necklace. So proteins are strings of amino acids. And if you could think of it, there are 20 different amino acids. And it's like a bead necklace made of 20 different colored beads. So plant and animal proteins, or plant and animal bead necklaces, are made of the same beads. They've got the same 20 colors. The only difference is the proportions of which, kind of mix of colors they're using. And like I said earlier, even within the world of animal proteins, every protein is unique. It has a unique string of colors and amounts of each one. And similarly with plant-based proteins. So there's a lot of overlap. There's nothing radically different fundamentally about a plant-based protein and an animal protein. But there are some trends that are probably why people tend to think that plant-based proteins are inferior. So I want to touch on the kernel of truth and then tell you why there's more to the story than that.
Do it. I'm ready. And I'm ready to learn because it's an area that I don't know very much about.
Yeah. It's an interesting field of study because it's one where it's very clear that what happens in smaller scale lab experiments and short term doesn't always translate to what we see in the big picture and the outcomes that we care about. So whenever we ask a general question, is A better than B? We have to be very clear about what outcome are we asking about. And so it's different if you're talking about, does it turn on muscle protein synthesis, in a cell culture dish versus does it build muscle mass in a human being over a 12-week training program? And so there are actually a lot of studies that show in what they call, the acute anabolic response. So if you feed, in experiments, if you do an experiment where you give protein in the same amount of different sources, the animal proteins do tend to kick up muscle protein synthesis and turn that muscle on a little bit better than the plant-based proteins. Now, you might think of it as kind of, yelling instructions at a different volume. So the animal proteins maybe have a bit higher volume of the signal that they're giving. And that's why it's commonly said that animal proteins are superior to plant-based proteins for anabolic response. Now that is well established for the acute phase, but there have not been experiments until about last year on does that translate to the whole body system when you actually run an experiment where you're doing resistance training and you're supplementing with protein and you're controlling exactly what the protein source is. And guess what? When you do that, there's no difference.
Really? None at all?
No.
So what about this is so fascinating. So what about the idea that, one of the amino acids, leucine, is one of the ones that's quickest to respond? Is that, again, you just saying, yes, we see that from an acute perspective, as in it's quick and the response is there, but as a prolonged argument over time, that's where the argument comes in. It isn't superior.
Exactly. So it is superior in an acute phase. And so when people have said, why is it that animal proteins in general tend to have kind of a more potent signal, antibiotic signal, they've thought that the slightly higher leucine levels are a reason. Now, I want to point out here that leucine levels are not as different as you think. So I was just looking at a graph this morning of leucine content of different proteins. And if you take purified protein powder, whey protein would maybe be about 9% leucine, and various plant-based proteins, if you just have the purified protein, they're going to be between 5 and even 12% leucine. And so part of there's two different layers happening here. One is how much leucine is there, and the other is how potently concentrated is the protein. So when you eat animal sources of protein, you tend to get a larger dose of protein in a single serving than when you eat a plant-based. But if you compare protein powders and you're comparing 20 grams of protein head to head, the amount of leucine is going to be marginally different.
That's so interesting. That's incredible. And then what about if we just dig into that a little bit more about the profiles? So you talk about protein packages. So the fact that plant-based proteins aren't a complete profile, and so animal sources are. So how do we overcome that, and do we even need to? Is that important?
Yeah, I think the term complete protein is a little bit of a misnomer, because really the way that you ascertain that is that there's a sort of an ideal balance of these different bead colors that you would want to have. And you're measuring what's the proportion of the different beads in this protein colors compared to the ideal. And in general, animal proteins line up a little bit better against that. But it's not a black and white thing where plants are actually missing any amino acids. So let's say the ideal amount is 100% of each one, and a plant-based protein might have 100% of everything except 80% of one. And so we're not talking about a deficiency. We're talking about something that's slightly lower, but as long as you're eating diversity of plants, other plant-based proteins will have more than 100. So it will balance out to give you 100% of every amino acid.
So in the scheme of things, we have to stop worrying about it. And I think that that's what I'm hearing from you in the message that you're saying is that, we want to encourage diversity in our nutrition all the time because we know from so many aspects, it's one of the best things that we can do for our body. Stop getting hung up on the small stuff.
Absolutely. I love helping people worry less. That is a big win in my books. So this rice and beans, just to drive this home, you've probably heard about that. And that's one of these things where there's a kernel of truth there because grains tend to be lower in lysine and legumes tend to be lower in methionine. But grains have plenty of methionine and legumes have plenty of lysine. So as long as you eat both of those, you're fine. But guess what? You don't even have to eat it in the same meal, as long as we're talking the same 24-hour period. So as long as your day has a little bit of legumes somewhere and a little bit of grain somewhere, they balance each other out fine. So we need to stress less about that food combining.
Right, yes. And that's such a relief. And, I grew up in the fitness world and I've done my nutritional training in that with a specific focus on sports nutrition. That was always what we were told. It's really clear that the evidence is emerging and that we need to keep current with what the current findings are. And for me, that to just bring that down to the basics, it's just saying to people, just make sure you eat enough protein throughout the day to support your body's needs.
Yeah. And plants have little bits of protein throughout the day rather than, you're getting it from that one steak, because you think of, legumes as a good protein source, and absolutely soy milk, any bean, lentils, those are all wonderful protein sources, but you also get a fair amount from quinoa and oats and other whole grains. So you're getting a little bit at a time. And so you don't have to worry about it as long as you're not going too heavy on just fruits and fats.
Yeah.
I just want to add one little fun fact that I think has given people peace of mind about the protein combining. An average adult has about 100 grams of amino acids, proteins worth of amino acids floating around in their body. You have this pool of amino acids that are free in your body because your body's constantly making proteins and breaking them down, So the amino acids that you take in at a meal, those are just being added on to an existing pool of amino acids. So it's not that you're going to suddenly have no available amino acids, right? You can draw on that reservoir all the time. So it takes the pressure off thinking about having every meal having the perfect amino acid composition.
Yeah. One of the reasons I think protein is talked about in the menopausal sort of nutritional world is the idea that it stabilizes our blood sugars as well. But the same happens for the plant-based proteins as well, just for anyone that's concerned about that. The mechanism remains the same, right?
Yeah.
She's got more. Sorry, I didn't interrupt you, Chana.
Just to reiterate, I think in terms of protein, it's kind of a hierarchy that the amount of protein matters most. And the source is, it's rounding error, as long as it's a decent quality protein and from diverse sources. So it's not absolutely zero. There maybe are some super subtle effects, but the amount that you're taking in is what matters most.
Which is actually just what I was going to ask you. So we have the recommended daily sort of dosage that is out there for us, but often feel like that's quite low when it comes to people who do say resistance training that really do want to support this muscle protein synthesis. Or anyone listening, just the ability to be able to maintain the muscles and potentially build. So what's your opinions on the RDA that's out there for protein at the moment?
Yeah, I think you really have to think about your protein goals in the context of protein target in the context of your personal goals. And I agree that the literature is very clear that if you're looking to support muscle mass and strength gains, that more protein than that would be advantageous. The latest meta-analysis that I saw, maybe 2018 or so, said up to 1.6 grams per kilogram but this is the context of young adults.
Right.
into strength gains. And you always have to look at the population to see if that's relevant. There are studies that suggest, a number of studies suggest that older adults are less responsive to that anabolic stimulus. And so that they, even as a baseline, even if they're not strength training, they're going to want to take in more protein just to maintain that muscle mass.
Yeah, and also, when they say like a certain like gram or per kilogram or pound, it really is the lean body mass that they're talking about. Because if anyone's obese and say they're in the 300-pound range, we don't want them to be eating 300 grams of protein a day. Literally, you'll be eating all day long. And so even just trying to use the calculations for most people is problematic and confusing.
Yeah.
And so I think like I personally, just from experience and the research that I've done, try and keep it like, say to women, try and get nearer the 100 grams or in and around that if you're strength training, without too much stress and without too much. Don't freak out if you only get 80, because that's still good. It's probably it's still more than the recommended daily amount.
Yes. And I think the literature also says it's better to get it throughout the day in little bits. The way that I think about it is that your muscles as you get older are just kind of wanting to doze off and have a nap, and you have to yell at them once in a while, like, wake up, we still need you, wake up, we still need you. And so you can give your muscles that signal through protein or through a workout.
Yeah. That's perfect. That's actually really great advice. Yeah. So, and then, so if we have this RDA and we know that we're sort of wanting to be into the, the upper numbers a little bit, like, I personally, and just speaking on behalf of you all ladies who are listening, like I struggle to eat a lot of meat personally because I don't like chewing my food. I hate the texture of meat. So I do eat chicken and I eat fish because I find that they just go down easier. And so I do supplement my protein source because I don't feel like I can get it in my meals easily. And so I do take a protein powder. I actually add it to my morning porridge. It's flavorless and it stirs in and it makes it super creamy. And anyway, so that's how I do it. What's your opinion on protein powders and supplements? Should we do them? Should we not do them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way that I view it is that they are very rarely essential, but they are convenient and they are safe. As with all things, the dose matters though. Protein powders, plant-based protein powders can contain heavy metals that you don't want to get a lot of in your body. And so I wouldn't go more than 2 scoops a day. I would recommend maybe 1 scoop a day is absolutely fine, 100% fine. But once you start to get into 2 scoops daily, I would be maybe aware of that, especially if you're a smaller person.
And always try and look for any nutrients from real food sources if you can. It's just the first 2 points. The whole point of a protein powder being called a supplement is that it should only supplement, not replace food. Yeah. And so, so be aware of that. I can't imagine having 2 scoops of protein every day. It just seems a lot anyway. But we aren't very big people, so maybe that's why.
Yeah. So I actually have a breakdown of all the amino acid profiles. I looked at a bunch of plant-based proteins and they all provide a pretty good mix of amino acids. So honestly, you can just go with the one that suits your tastes. I probably wouldn't choose rice only for a couple of reasons. One, because rice tends to absorb the most arsenic from the soil. So I would just be like the most aware of that. And I tend to like the blends personally, just because those are actually designed to have, as close to an optimal amino acid profile as you need. But it is a supplement. So you're going to be getting plenty of protein from the rest of your day, hopefully as well.
Hopefully. What about one of the reasons I don't use plant-based is because obviously I don't have a problem with taking weight. I don't have any effects of like bloating that some people do. But I've never found a good plant protein that doesn't taste chalky. Like that's one of the problems I've had with plant-based. I don't ever recommend brands anyway, but why are they chalky? Why does that happen?
I don't actually know because I've always had plant-based, so I can't really compare it to whey. I would just experiment with a few of them and see. There's some of it's the ingredients can also be the different sweeteners. I don't really know. There's nothing fundamentally different about plant-based proteins when you're just at the amino acid level that should make that be the case. So maybe if they're more highly purified, I don't know if there's some secondary ingredient plant-based component that's contributing.
And possibly they've evolved since I tried plant-based proteins, which was a long time ago. I just buy unflavored, unsweetened, the most basic you can get.
Yeah, no, I have heard people say that they didn't find anything they liked previously, and now they've experimented and found something they do like.
Yeah, which is
worth another try. My husband says the same thing about the fake meats, that they used to be not palatable, and now he can't get enough of them.
So when I was a vegetarian back in the day, so I was 18, and I don't even want to do the math now. It's a long time ago, 30 years ago, 30 plus years ago. The only plant-based or vegetarian food I could get was by Linda McCartney, who was the ex-wife. Well, she died actually, didn't she? But she was the wife of Paul McCartney. She was a vegetarian, and it was like eating cardboard. And for the longest time, when you ever got a vegetarian meal, even outside of the house, it was either cardboard burgers or mushroom stroganoff. They were the only two things on the menu. We've evolved so well. We even have whole restaurants, right?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that they've now developed these products that are much more meat-like. I think there was, this notion before that anyone who was choosing to avoid meat didn't want anything that replicated meat, but there are actually people that do want that are choosing to avoid it for other reasons. And so therefore they actually like the sensory experience of meat.
And so you went to school with the creator of Impossible Meats?
Yeah. He was kind of my vegan inspiration, actually, when he was still running his lab at Stanford, and he's a ridiculously smart person. And he took a sabbatical year and decided that his energy was better put towards doing something for the planet. And so he, finally phased out his lab after several decades of running it and started Impossible Foods. And it's amazing to see what a biochemist can do, right? Because he's looking at this from a kind of an engineering perspective, and what's the catalog that nature offers, and how could we use what plants have to mimic, the entire sensory experience of meat. And they've really done a really good job making it so realistic that a lot of vegetarians don't even want to have an Impossible Burger because it kind of bleeds, and it's just ultra realistic.
It bleeds and it's juicy, but it's usually beetroot that's doing it. But what's interesting is I became aware of it because of my son. And if you ever want to know how the Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat is made, this Mark Roper, and his name is Roper. He's an ex-NASA engineer, and he did a deep dive, and he went into the kitchen and they showed you how they built the foods. And it was specifically for people like my children and my husband that want to make better ethical choices for the environment and for their health. And so, sorry, what were you going to say about
what's unique about the Impossible Burger and the bleeding is that they use a plant-based version of heme. And they're the only ones that do this. And it's called soy Leghemoglobin, and it's from the root nodules of the soy plant. So other companies tend to use beet as their main thing, but they actually have heme in there, which they have heme iron. So actually, for an iron perspective, it's actually really cool because it's super bioavailable iron. But it also contributes to the chemistry of the meat actually turning from pink to brown when it cooks. And that's one of the things they worked with top chefs during development, because they wanted it to cook like meat as well. And that's where having a biochemist, at the helm. Really,
it's incredible. It's actually a really amazing story. And especially when you do taste test, we bought a few of them, and we cooked burgers as well. And we did a taste test in the family. And, so now it's on our menu once a week. Is this something we should be looking at doing? Do you think it's a healthy way to eat? What's your opinion? I know you're excited because of the chemistry behind it. What's your feelings from a nutritional standpoint?
Yeah. I think nutritionally, the Impossible Burger is not particularly a huge win over. I mean, it depends what you're eating instead always, right? So I would say over a beef burger, it probably has a small advantage just because beef in general is not associated with great health outcomes. We don't really know all the details on why some of that saturated fat. Impossible does have a fair amount of saturated fat as well. So I think one thing that when you're talking about these plant-based burgers, it's really important to consider the big picture of the meal, because you see these nutritional comparisons between a burger, a beef burger, and a plant-based burger. And the patty is maybe, a quarter or a third of the calories and a quarter or a third of the sodium and all of that. So it's a very different story if you're getting these at a fast food restaurant, with fries and a soda, versus if you're cooking it at home on a whole wheat bun with fresh toppings, which is what we do.
Yes, and it's apples and oranges. They're not comparable. Yeah. And it's also moving away from the idea that food is good and bad and all this moralistic labels around food as well. I mean, the whole purpose of these type of foods is because they wanted to introduce a valuable source of food in people's diets that is ethical, that it's good for the environment, good. And so I just think that having it there in the shelves in the supermarket and it not look odd anymore, and you see, everyone eating them now is, I think, just great. Yeah. It's interesting though, because we also follow the stocks and shares in our house. We're a financial family, and the shares from both of these companies have nosedived, and I don't understand why, because people asked for them and they were created, but the demand is going down a little bit. So it's just, I'm following the story with interest, right?
Yeah.
To see where this goes. So,
one thing I want to say nutritionally is that I wouldn't think of them as, when they say eat your fruits and veggies, that's not what they mean, right? So they don't have the fiber that plants offer. So I don't think of them as a way to, fill your half your plate with fruits and veggies, but they are a way to eat less meat. That's their goal.
Right. And I mean, that's a really great point, right? So what you're trying to do with your message as well is not just say, there are other options out there for you. It's also, do you realize how important it is to eat lots and lots of plant-based food? Yes, more of us need to do that. And I think what I think is a confusing message is that you've got hardcore vegans saying nobody should ever eat meat. And then you've even got the carnivores that never eat vegetables. Let's not go there. Whereas in fairness, a lot of the magic happens in the messy middle. And if you were to replace at least 1 or 2 meals a week and make them plant-based, you're doing amazing things for the environment, for your health. And so consider doing small changes at a little bit every now and again. Put more vegetables on your plate than you're used to. Actually try experiment in different ways to make some small changes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that you do see, in observational studies, vegetarians tend to have good health outcomes. And I think a lot of that comes from the amount of fruits and veggies they eat, not the absence of meat. I mean, there are certain types of meat, obviously, like processed red meats that are consistently associated with all sorts of bad outcomes. But for a lot of, meat and dairy products, there's not really a strong case to be made that any amount is toxic, which is what some vegans will tell you. And I don't subscribe to that. I subscribe to eating more, fruits and veggies and whole grains, and that being something that can really benefit your health.
Yeah. And for sure, when they've done any sort of research in nutrition to go through perimenopause and menopause, it's always the Mediterranean style diets that are the ones that are coming to the forefront, which are an abundance of plant-based with lean proteins, right? So it sort of falls into line with that too. We're coming towards the end of our conversation, and we've only just started talking, but I might get you back on. But I actually want to just touch quickly on one last thing, and it's this whole idea in the fitness and wellness world that natural is better. And we see this all the time, and it's often used as a way to blame and shame women for making choices that don't go along the natural route. So I'm going to just hand the floor over to you and let you talk about, the naturalist fallacy and what that means and how to apply that to our life.
Yeah, I see that so much on social media and in, just in my peer group. It's everywhere. And I came from hippie parents, so I have hippie dippy tendencies, but I'm also a scientist, and I've worked in drug development, and I know how to read papers. I've done a lot of following the COVID pandemic as well, all the science there. And it's really something that is self-limiting. If you shun absolutely anything that's synthetic, it really doesn't do you any favors. So in terms of just, if you want to back up and look at just a chemistry perspective, it's just absolutely clear that whether or not something comes from nature tells you nothing about its safety. If you want to know how safe something is, you need to actually test it. And that's what we do. So you've had discussions about hormone therapy and bioidenticals, and this is relevant in that context, just as an example, where I would way rather take something that was synthetic that had actually been rigorously tested in animals and humans than something that was natural but hadn't been validated or tested. So we don't know what the safe dose is and we don't know the potential side. This safety process that we have in place for regulated compounds is there for a reason. And so, just off the top of my head, nature, what people say something is safe because it's natural. I say, well, what about heavy metals? What about all the toxins that all the, plants can make and animals can make to fight off, predators. Those actually can be used as pesticides, by the way. So just because something is made by nature doesn't make it safe. Nature is full of toxins. Nature also has lots of good stuff, but there's by no means a guarantee something is safe because it's natural. And the flip side is true. You can have things made in labs. Lots of the drugs in the pharmacy are very well tested. We know their safety profiles and they're absolutely safe. The key is, have they been tested and do we know what the safe dose is?
Yeah, it's a really great way to explain it. And then just adding on to that from the hormonal therapy side of it, the messaging from sort of the people that market hormones to make a profit, like a lot of the time it's the unregulated hormones, will say these are natural, these come from yams, and we know nobody's chopping a yam in half and rubbing it on their thigh. These are still synthesized in a lab, right? All of them are. So I think that it's just disingenuous to push that nature is best when it's not. It's actually not accurate a lot of the time. Things are even natural, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really big on the message that the dose makes the poison, and you could overdose on kale or carrots or anything. You can get into trouble if you just go too extreme on anything. And so the key is that, are you giving an appropriate medicine at an appropriate dose? And if you don't know what the dose is and this compound hasn't been tested, like I say, everything is chemicals. So you don't know what that's doing in your body if it hasn't been tested.
Yeah. And so it's okay to question these claims. That's what I always say. It's okay to ask the questions. So we've come to the end of our time. Oh my goodness. I could talk to you all day. But, going back to the plant-based eating, if anybody's listening here and they want to, try make some changes and adopt the plant-based eating philosophy, what are some things that they can do to make this easier? And I sort of want you just to leave us with a couple of tips, because it can feel overwhelming. I actually bought a cookbook for my family, the Otto Lengi cookbook, and it was called Kitchen or Eating Made Simple. And I was like, this is not simple. So give us some tips, Chana, that you think will help us.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of different approaches you could take. Some people like the approach of, plant-based until noon. So maybe pick a meal. Some people say, let's start with breakfast and see how can I have a plant-based breakfast. And so if you could try that approach, and then, or you can think of it in terms of, staples. So most of us have, 5 or 6 things we make a week. So let's start with one of those and try to have a plant-based version of it. So maybe instead of eggs, you try having a tofu scramble. And maybe instead of a shepherd's pie, you have a lentil shepherd's pie. Maybe on taco night, you have a bean taco night. And if you're having trouble, warming up to legumes, maybe just try some of the meat alternatives as a first step. And then, if you want to work your way down to something that's going to give you more of the, eat your veggies benefits in addition to it's not meat anymore. One more thing to try is just on the beverages, right? So try, instead of dairy milk, there's so many different plant-based options now. Personally, I have oat milk in my morning tea. The barista blend is the best. And then I like to have almond milk in my coffee, and my kids have soy milk in our oatmeal or a smoothie. So there's I have, my fridge is like an entire cornucopia of different milk options, but there are different milks that work well for different purposes. So have some fun experimenting with them.
Yeah, I was going to say experiment with those. We use oat milk in our oatmeal because it actually makes it taste super creamy. It's so nice. Yeah. And so that's great. And I'm hearing from you, it's all or something. It's not all or nothing, right?
Yeah, I think it can be too overwhelming to try and go whole hog. I mean, some people like to do that, but I think most people do better kind of just trying kind of one substitution at a time or one meal at a time. That's what's worked for a lot of my friends anyways.
Yeah. And that's how we've adopted it. And it's actually quite a lot of fun. I think so. And it can be so tasty as well. I think moving away from the idea that plant-based food is boring. It's not.
Yes. I think the messaging around vegetables in your household is super important. As a mother of 3 vegetarian kids, I try to say more which veggie do you want rather than eat your veggies, and find the ones that they like. And I think I actually saw a study out of Stanford that mentioned that the way that you present the vegetable, try these healthy carrots versus try these delicious carrots, really influences the amount people choose in the cafeteria. So think about how you're marketing your vegetables to yourself and your family.
I mean, this is really very typical of me, but I used to say to my kids, broccoli makes you get a big penis. So That worked. They love broccoli. I don't know if it actually works. I don't go too deep into that, but do it. So how can people find you? What's the best way to find you, Chana?
I think the best place is to go to my website, fueledbyscience.com, because I have links there to all my social channels. So I'm at Fueled by Science on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, but you can get to all of that from my website. You can also get to my podcast from there as well.
That's great. And go and check her out on Instagram. She's one of my favorite followers. I always like the stuff that you put out there because you try and make it accessible, right? You're a scientist that's making things palatable for people. And I really appreciate that.
We didn't talk about COVID, but I want to put in a plug for a site that I write for called Dear Pandemic. I'm one of the contributing authors. So if anyone wants science-based information about COVID, they have great Q&As in digestible terms from people who know what they're talking about.
Oh, right. That's great. Thank you for that. That's awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, Chana, and thank you everybody for joining us this week. It's been great. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Just before you tune out, I just want to jump in with some fun facts that I found out from Chana after we'd finished the podcast recording. There's two things we're going to talk about. So do you remember when we spoke about impossible meats? And when we were talking about them, we were talking about an iron-containing molecule. That iron-containing molecule is called Leghemoglobin. Impossible actually genetically engineers microbes to crank out that soy Leghemoglobin protein. It's actually very similar to how many drugs are made, similar to insulin. And apparently people get really worked up about this because it's not a natural process, even though the protein product at the end is identical to what you're going to find in the roots of the soy plant. It's actually very cool. And Chana has provided 2 articles that I'm going to attach to the notes of this podcast for you to read if you're interested. Now, the second thing we spoke about, another fun fact, is the difference between whey protein and plant proteins and that texture, that chalkiness. And I mentioned how I struggled with plant protein because of that chalky nature. Chana got back to me with another fun fact about that and sort of said, well, we know that whey is the rock star when it comes to solubility, and that proteins in plant-based powders are typically much less soluble than whey. Anyway, it's universally known, apparently, that whey protein ticks a lot of the boxes. It's abundant, it's so cheap, high quality, and very soluble. But in the plant world, it's just harder to find all of those components all at once. Powders are typically made from plant seeds like soya beans and peas, etc. And these proteins generally are designed by nature not to melt when they get wet. Anyway, Chana has given me another list of articles that I'm going to tag in the show notes, and she wants to shout out to her botanist father-in-law, Pat Brown, for this information. In fact, she calls him Patopedia because he knows everything, which I thought was extremely cute. Anyway, I hope you found those little tidbits at the end useful, and I thank you again for joining. Bye for now. Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you like what you hear, then why not subscribe to this podcast and leave me a review? You see, when you do this, it helps to raise the profile of my show and attract new listeners. And it also allows me to continue to deliver valuable content with great guests. And in return for you doing that, I will send you my 12-week core-focused program called Abs on Fire as a thank you. Simply drop me an email at amanda@amandathebe.com and I'll wing that your way. Bye.